noticed that some people are wearing masks, some people are not wearing masks. We're seeing people getting boosted, and we are encouraging people to do so, just as part of our collective effort to protect each other and ensure that we remain in a endemic phase rather than re-entering a pandemic phase of COVID. So we're encouraging people to get boosted if they can, wear masks if they feel comfortable doing so, particularly in congregate settings. And as we go into the winter months, let's be very attentive to make sure that if we see an uptick, that we change our behaviors. So let's get this show on the road. This is going to be a terrific, terrific discussion today. And thank you so much for joining in. Welcome to the Nonprofit Report, your update on nonprofit organizations, issues, and leaders. I'm your host, Mark Oppenheim. Today, we're discussing the challenges of getting food on the tables for families across the United States with special guests. Dr. Melony Samuel, CEO and founder of the Campaign Against Hunger in New York. Celia Cole, CEO of Feeding Texas. And Monica White, President and CEO of Food Share of Ventura County in California. A reminder to Zoom attendees that we take 3 snap polls during the show and we'll announce results. And your questions submitted to the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen will be included in our discussion. So thank you all. Thank you very much for joining us. One of my great pleasures is I get to speak with people who are way smarter than I am on these types of issues. Well, I'm going to set this up and go to Melony just by saying over 53 million people in the United States came to food banks last year for help. And the challenge to feed families seems to be growing. In fact, while economists seem to talk about American economy as if it's one thing, we actually have many economies existing side by side. And Melony is just in a great position to talk about that issue because you live, Melony, in one of the wealthiest places in the world and also one of the poorest places in the world. Could you talk a little bit about how that actually functions and what you coined this term food justice. What do you mean by that? What do you mean by food justice when you're talking about walking down the street and seeing on one side of the street all this wealth and the other side of the street all this poverty existing side by side?
Thank you, Mark. And that's a very good question. Honestly, the word food justice have been spoken about so many times across our nation, but what does it really mean? And who have really been affected, or how do we make changes? Well, for me, when I think of food justice, it's ensuring universal access to healthy, nutritious, culturally appropriate food, and of course, making sure that it is affordable. It also involves advocating for safety and the well-being of those that are food insecure.
Melony, you have a huge buzz on your microphone. I mean, a really huge buzz, almost to the point of not being able to.
Okay, hold on. I think it might be my ear. Let me turn this off.
Monica, could you jump in? What do you see in terms of this idea of justice? And then we'll come back to Melony in a bit. This whole idea of again, Ventura County, a very interesting place with this combination of wealth and poverty. How do you see the problem from your perspective, Melony?
We see the same thing. I mean, in that Ventura County is a very affluent community, yet we're serving thousands and thousands of people who are just trying to make ends meet. And that the talk about food justice, that we want to be able to ensure that everybody who needs food is able to access it. And whether that be a farm worker, and then we need to actually go to the fields to be able to provide to them, or if it's a senior who's homebound, being able to get that food to them, in addition to all of the pantries that we operate, and ensuring that it's in every single area, so there are no food deserts, so people don't need to travel that far in order to be able to get food. That's all extremely important to us, and what we struggle with every day.
And it's so ironic, right? Farm workers who are actually picking the crops, needing to go to a food bank in order to gain access to the crops, or to the diversity of nourishment so that their families can actually survive.
Absolutely. And, it's all about timing as well. We at the start of pandemic, we were doing a drive-through distribution, and we thought doing it from 2 to 4 would be enough time. Well, we found out that the farm workers weren't getting off in time. And so they were unable to access even the drive-through distribution. So we ended up working with the farmers, being able to find out when do they get off, and then we bring the food directly to them.
And Celia, I see that you're nodding. So this story is very familiar to you too, correct?
Yes, it is, Mark. And thanks so much for inviting me to be part of this conversation. Yeah, I want to echo things that Dr. Samuels and Monica have said about food justice. And it really derives, obviously, from USDA's definition of what food security means. And I think in Texas, we talk about, right food, right time, right place. And so it's not just about getting food out there, but it's making sure that it gets to the right people and it gets to them in a way that is accessible to them. And I think it's really important to recognize that the people growing our food are also struggling with food insecurity. And so the idea of the food justice movement is going beyond the food security movement and really looking at that as well. In Texas, we've run a produce initiative for about 20 years now. We call it a win-win-win because we capture rescue surplus produce that's unsellable. That helps farmers. It gives them an outlet for surplus that they would otherwise have to pay to dispose of. It also kind of helps them offset some of the losses that we know farmers are prone to. It then gets food to hungry people. It improves health. It reduces environmental hazards of food waste. But really, I think the support that it provides to farmers is really key, and it's part of that food justice concept. Oh, you're on mute, Mark.
So, Mark, I just wanted to add to what Cecilia and Monica said in reference to farmers overall. We also look at New York City, and we are advocating for the BIPOC farmers because those are the ones that are left behind. We need to see them farm their own land, right? And those that are actually having their space, many of the farmers I know are struggling, especially during the time of COVID. Farmers right now are at risk of losing their property. And so when we talk about food justice, we want to ensure also that the farmland goes across the board and that everyone has access, not only any one specific set of families, but we want to make sure that the farmers overall have access, and not only have access, has their vehicle and all the resources needed to bring food, especially to New York City, where food is so expensive.
Well, you're both making a really important point in that we seem to have a systemic issue, not only in the supply chain, but also in the growing and the origination of the food, and where we have farmers, whether it's because they are family farmers or because of the location or because of gas prices or because BIPOC farmers have been disadvantaged in our federal farm support programs for so many decades. People are being driven out of business, and they are being driven into the food banks because of the loss of wealth. Do we have a systemic problem in this issue in this country when it comes to the supply chain for food, where we have people who are growing food not able to actually feed themselves and avail themselves of the food that they're growing, as Monica says, or do we have other issues that really need a sort of a rethinking of how food functions in this country? Celia, can you give it a shot, and then we're going to go around to Melony and Monica. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think when we talk about food security, we're not just talking about individuals being food secure, being able to access the food they need to feed their families. We're talking about the overall security of our food system, so to speak. And so whether that's at the origin or at points along the supply chain, yeah, I think it's definitely a system that's fraught with lots of problems. And if we're going to really look at food security holistically and really embrace this concept of food justice, that, yeah, we do need to look at that disconnect.
Melanie, what do you think about this in terms of systemic responses to what seems to be a systemic problem? 53 million people is a huge number, a huge amount of our population to be availing itself of food banks.
Yes, I have to agree with Cecilia, right? And not only that, we have put so much in our healthcare system, right? And we've also put money in our food system. But what we have against us, we look at climate change, right? Right now we're viewing all the problems that are facing the farmers and the land issue and gas and all these resources that they need to bring forth. But we also have climate issue that is going to come into the play. Right now where we are, grain is very hard to get. And I know that there has been, with Ukraine and Russia, there's been a changeover, but nevertheless, it has not trickled down yet. So what you're finding, for instance, the campaign against hunger, we have been serving New York City for 24 years. In the height of the pandemic, we found ourselves in a place where we had to literally change our model in order to get food to families. We have built a new model in New York City that has been adopted by so many robust pantries. It's no longer robust pantries. We are now in a different place. Why are we doing this? Because we recognize that when disaster hits, not only are farmers accessible to the disaster itself, they find themselves being impacted by the disaster, but city-wide urban families working poor, and everyone else is being affected. And so what happens is, especially during the pandemic, it took us weeks, and I mean weeks, to get food in. Unbelievable, but it took us weeks, and the cost of food. So now we have to really look at the food system. What was built is not working. Let's just all face it. The way it's been done, it's not working. It's now time for us to look at what works best and start investing in what works best so that we can put food insecurity behind us. We can alleviate it by working together and look at exactly what is on the table and let those that have the skill set and the know-how join together and come up with a solution. And I'm talking universal, I'm talking national, right? And I think some of that would help to work on the problem we're presently facing.
Is part of this sort of connecting the dots between health and food? Is part of this how we've been thinking about food? We seem to, in this country, have encouraged kind of a monoculture of food supply chain based in corn, for example, based in wheat, very few crops. And as the climate gets hotter, the climate is less hospitable to certain of those crops, right? Corn does not thrive as well in water. It's not a drought tolerant crop. Monica, as you're looking at the situation that you're facing, and taking Melony's point about grains, for example, the prices of grains going up, and the kind of in fuel intensive farming that we do, which means that gas prices are having a disproportionate impact on the entire food supply chain. Do you see, and we're going to talk a little bit about sort of what you do to alleviate immediate need. Do you see a rethinking that we as citizens ought to be undertaking in terms of our own consumption habits, our own supply chain, how we think about these things? Government, nonprofits, is this an all-in kind of a call to action at this point?
Yes, the latter. It's all in. There's not one silver bullet that's gonna solve all of it, and it's the combination of all of those. And I think that's so wonderful that we have a New York and we have Ventura County, 3,000 miles apart. We are in the agricultural center of California, and that we have so much produce that we can't use it all. And so
get it to market, right? I mean, it's just basically rotting in the fields. It can't be picked, it can't be moved, right?
Right. And so that brings up this issue of that. So we're part of the California Association of Food Banks, as well as Feeding America. And the food banks have put together a farm to family program, which accesses additional produce. And so we say, farming to excess. We want to be able to grab all of that additional produce and be able to get it to the food banks who can use it. I'll give you strawberries, for example. We have more strawberries than we're able to use. We're right by the Port of Hueneme. Sometimes we'll get literally tons of pineapple or bananas that will go bad before we're able to even use them.
So we have fertilizer, we have labor, we have land, we have water. It's all been invested in creating this pineapple, creating this strawberry. Don't have anybody to pick it, right? We have
or the transportation to get it to them. So we have New York who is saying, I will take all of your extra strawberries, all of your extra bananas, but the cost of getting something from one end to the other is what is really prohibitive. And it skyrocketed during COVID, and it's really stayed up there. And what cost us $700 for a truckload is now $1,500. Which means that affects the food banks and how much food we can actually purchase.
You need the drivers and so on and so forth. We have a labor problem, right? And we also have this sort of gamesmanship going on in the southern border states in terms of not basically being overwhelmed by a huge number of illegal immigrants, because we haven't figured out a way to provide work visas to these people who could actually work in agriculture, for example, where there is a tremendous need. Celia, how do you see these interconnected elements? Isn't there something, because this is not a political party thing. This is an American thing. We should all be able to come together and say, agriculture needs labor. We need to get things from one place to another. How do we come together? It just seems to me to be kind of nonsensical that everybody's sort of throwing darts at each other rather than solving problems.
Yeah, and I mean, what Monica was talking about with their farm to family initiative, there's, similar collaboratives around the country of involving food banks and regional efforts to rescue produce. And I think one of the benefits of us all being part of Feeding America is they're trying to provide some of that the connecting of dots between those different, where there's supply and where there's demand, and trying to help us address some of the transportation issues. But one thing, I think it's really good that we're all here together talking about long-term solutions and the bigger picture and the systemic problems. But food banks in the meantime, you'll resonate with this. I think, we have to deal with the immediate problem of people being hungry. So while we're working to kind of fix the system, we also have to deal with the casualties of the system. And so one thing I don't want to get lost in all of this is we're talking about food security and farm security, et cetera, is income security. And really, when you talk about hunger, it's not so much a food problem as it is a money problem. And so when people are coming to food banks for help, they don't have the money to afford food on their own. And there are food deserts in many poor areas of the country, but if you look at what it means to be in a food desert, it's really about, can you access a grocery store that has affordable food? And there's plenty of wealthier communities in this country that could qualify under that definition, but the difference is that people there have the money. And so if it's not easy for them to access food nearby, they can order online, they can travel to the Whole Foods that's 10 miles away. But when it comes to the people we serve, the reason that they're facing hunger, it's an income problem. They don't have adequate resources to afford food. So I think, hunger is a very intersectional issue. And we've talked about some of the intersections, but really figuring out how to improve income security in this country, reduce income inequality, I think is also really key here.
So let's talk a little bit and see if you could continue on, because you mentioned the fact that we have an immediate problem. We have a systemic issue, and we've talked about income, we've talked about labor, we've talked about the cost of trucking, fuel, inflation, all these different issues. But let's talk a little bit about the immediate problem. So if you can continue, and then we're going to go to Melony. Talk about actually what you do every single day in order to deal with somebody who is hungry, whose kids are really in distress, to start to alleviate that distress.
Sure. Well, right now about 1 in 8 Texans suffers from food insecurity. And obviously that number skyrocketed during the pandemic. And I think Dr. Samuels mentioned earlier the sort of need for the charitable food assistance system to really reinvent itself to be able to meet that increased need. And while some of it's come down with the pandemic easing into an endemic situation, we're now seeing obviously the impacts of inflation that are hitting people and food banks, because those rising costs in fuel and fertilizer, that's also affecting obviously the people growing food and the food banks. So it's a really enormous problem. I mean, we're seeing millions of Texans daily who are struggling to afford food. And I think, one of our food banks has sort of coined the saying, food for today, food for tomorrow, food for life, and figuring out how to build food bank services around that so that, the bread and butter, no pun intended, of what we do is meeting that immediate need with the food box. And it's hopefully a really diverse food box that includes lots of fresh fruits and vegetables and other things that people need to be immediately meeting their nutritional needs. But we know that most people come to us. It's not a one-time need. It's not just an immediate crisis. It's an ongoing crisis. It's chronic food insecurity. We know that most people come to us 6 or 7 times a year. And so what can we do to sort of, tackle the food for tomorrow? When they leave our food pantry, we know that the food's going to only last so long and that they're going to continue to have need. So we work very closely with the state agency that administers the SNAP program, formerly the food stamp program, to connect the eligible families that are coming to us for immediate help to that ongoing assistance, because we know that SNAP is the largest and most important anti-hunger fighting program in this country. And then along with that, getting them connected to other services like Medicaid, long-term care services. If they're really poor in Texas, you can qualify for the welfare program. So getting them connected to cash assistance if they're eligible, just to kind of stabilize and provide that food for tomorrow. And then Food for Life is really about, I think, working closely with our partners across the nonprofit system, whether it's in healthcare or workforce development, housing, to make sure that those sort of systemic drivers of food insecurity, those sort of upstream causes, that we work very closely with them to figure out, okay, what else do the people coming to us for immediate food aid need in terms of, getting a better job, finding more stable housing, dealing with an underlying health issue. So that's the piece that I think food banks have been tackling, at least for a decade now, but really where it's newer for us, and it really involves building deep and wide partnerships across the nonprofit spectrum.
And Melony, you started your whole organization, your whole approach with this sort of integrative idea at the intersection of justice and food, haven't you?
Yes, I have. And to us, dignity is important. The only difference with what I've just heard is that we have implemented other things. We look at workforce program as a key part of food justice. We have a robust workforce program. We have youths that, in other words, we are fighting crime by using our workforce program, food. We also have implemented areas where online cyber pantries. And now we have families, because what it is that you have those that work sometimes 70 plus, but yet struggle because of the cost of living in New York City. So one would say someone or two people together making $70+ per year is, why would you need a food pantry? But that's not so in New York City. The cost of living, the cost of homes have increased exponentially. And so we find that many families are coming, and some want to come, but they are somewhat shying away because they're a little ashamed. They still have a car, they're a little ashamed. So what we've done, we've implemented an online system that they never have to come in. Yet we have partnership with DoorDash, where we do door to shop and deliver, like the Amazon style. So that has worked out. We've seen a vast increase in that. The Campaign Against Hunger on a whole served 14,000 families every week. We have dispersed during the pandemic over 30 million meals, which is an enormous amount beyond even our capacity. But what we have done is that we saw the need that instead of where we were working, we had to find a much larger space, both in Brooklyn and in Queens. And by doing that, we believe that we have really strengthened how we have approached food insecurity, because we build partners on the ground. Whereas most food banks bring their food to us, we're saying that we will go to individuals, not just to an organization, but we'll find leaders in our community that knows their community, know the senior that is hungry, the single mother, those that are disabled, those that are most vulnerable. And what we will do is turn around and ensure that these families, so by building great partnership is a unique way of fighting hunger. It's food justice on the whole, getting the right produce in, right? Also looking overall at our food system to see how best can we reach. I know we talked about traveling and the cost. So we have been doing a lot of hydroponics. We're looking at that as another way. Right now we grow over 20,000, we're growing 20,000 pounds, about 20,000 pounds of food. We see in the next, by 2025, that we will be able to triple or quadruple that number by the method that we're using, but also increasing, like I talk about, workforce program. We talk about educating our community to make choices. It's very difficult. We run farmers market, mobile farmers market, where the cost is exceptionally low, so that families can access healthy food. Whereas farmers market on a whole, they're great, but most times people who are living in poverty cannot shop there. They have to go back to the supermarket, and supermarkets are very rare in our community.
And
Families are used to
the thing that I think is so fascinating here is that these are all citizen initiatives, right? This is not government. This is basically citizen initiatives. And we've just completed a few polls. One is that 80% of the people who responded said that they have either themselves or know someone else who have access to a food bank. That's 80%. And then we talked about solving the problem in a systemic way. 63% said that government and policymakers have the primary role, and nobody said that this wasn't a problem. Everybody recognized this is a problem. And then in terms of the change in the system, it's interesting. 40%, the highest number of answers came from increasing income, the minimum wage in particular. So we asked, what would be the most helpful change in the U.S. to create a more equitable food system? And we had questions about decreasing food waste, more funding for food banks, and so on. But the most answers were given to a wage issue. Monica, when you look at your situation here, do you get your food from businesses? And if you get the food from businesses, how does that actually work? Are people just contributing their the food that they can't bring to market? How do you ensure that your supply remains robust, given that the needs seem to be unending?
Yeah, that food sourcing is the number one issue for every single food bank, because without food, we would be completely irrelevant. So we work with every single retail outlet in Ventura County. Everybody has their own territory, because every day there's food that they're no longer able to sell, but is still perfectly good. So we rescue, was what we call it. We rescue all of that food. But then we also work with packing houses. We work with, as I said, the port. We work with farmers. Anybody who has any food within our territory, we're in constant contact with them, and we're there to be able to pick up anything the minute that it is available. We also purchase only about 20% of our food, which is way up from when pre-pandemic. But we also have the government, USDA provides through the Farm Bill. They provide, it's called TFAP, the Emergency Food Assistance Program, that goes to low income community members.
So you have basically, again, an all-in kind of an activity here. You have retail outlets, you have the growers getting involved, you have members of community, you have government involved, and then of course you have your army of volunteers involved. So people are basically trying to take an all-in approach. How often do you have political arguments in that process? Or are people all from all stripes? No, I'm serious. because we seem to always focus on what divides us. But you have people who are working for common cause across all different parts of the political spectrum. We should function like that as a country, shouldn't we, Monica?
Yes, I completely agree. We don't see that here. We all work very closely. We all work very well together because we're all in this going for the same mission. We all have the same end goal in mind, is to be able to, if there is food, we're going to get it to the nearest food bank. We're going to get it to the nearest pantry. As long as it is going to someone in need, we consider that a win. But I kind of wanted to go back to when we were talking about policy. In that about the government, it being their responsibility. SNAP is incredibly important to all of our food banks. What we do is much smaller than what SNAP provides. We provide 1 meal for every 9 meals that SNAP provides. So, public policy and advocacy is huge for us. To be able to ensure that farm bill, continues, and that those government commodities come through. That is huge for us.
So what you're saying is that part of a government's responsibility is to actually support those people who don't have power, who don't necessarily have the means. It's basically our responsibility, those people who do have means as taxpayers, to take care of our of other members of the American family, isn't it?
It's reality. That is what it is right now. And as the food banks, we're the safety net. We're underneath that program. That if anybody falls through that in the end of the month, let's just say that they don't qualify for SNAP, and we keep them from being homeless because we are able to provide them with food so they can pay their mortgage, they can pay their rent, they can keep their cars. So we're that very last safety net beneath all of those huge government programs.
So if you care about homelessness encampments, make sure that people don't have to become homeless because they can't afford to put food on their plate. Melony, I'd like to give you a word, and then Celia will give Texas the last word. But Melony, how do you see how we should function here? How do you see us taking the lessons that you've learned and taking them to heart as a country, and start acting together to solve this problem once and for all?
I truly believe it's important for us to work together. And I have seen such a difference, and quickly saying that how food insecurity was approached years ago, I've really seen a light at the end of the tunnel. And I believe that we're going in the right directions, and we can make a change in the method. We're looking at what works, and it's working. I appreciate my governor, I appreciate my mayor, and those that are in all the legislative officers, because they work well with us and they want to know what's going on in their community, and they have been a voice in the community against food insecurity. My neighbors and friends are working also. So we find that in New York City, although there is maybe a longer line than anywhere else, we are really addressing the problem the best way we have. Right now, it's a little difficult. In the next 2 months, we are really struggling overall because there seem to be very little resources. So right now, there's a struggle. But I do look at the end of the tunnel in a few years to come, and I think that a lot of our services will have made a vast difference in the lives of families, and there is positive changes to come.
And Celia, how do you see us solving this issue, or do you see this issue as being something that we as Americans can actually solve?
Oh, definitely. I mean, I think we often say, hunger is a problem that we can can't afford to ignore. We can't afford to solve. It's not. I don't think it's an intractable problem. I think one of the reasons that it's so important to ensure that people are nourished is that getting food to people, feeding people, that's kind of a low cost solution when you compare it to the cost of the consequences, which is, whether it's poor health or homelessness. I think that those problems down the chain are a lot more complicated and more expensive to solve. It's not that expensive or hard to figure out how to get food to people. And I think that's why even in Texas, which is a very polarized state right now, we have support across the political spectrum for making sure that we keep Texans fed. And we saw this throughout the pandemic. People understood that, if we could at a minimum keep people fed, that it was going to be a lot easier to keep those families resilient throughout the pandemic. So,
I think you're making a very, very important point. We are in every state divided, including in Texas, including in California, including throughout the United States. But we don't need to be. We have problems, we can solve them, right? We have a labor shortage in this country. We have people who want to come to this country. We should come together and figure out some sort of rational approach to deal with this stuff instead of scoring political points. The borders need to be secured, of course, but we also need people to do work in the fields. We need people who will get those crops to market. We need the energies of the entire country to come together to solve these kinds of problems. Dr. Melony Samuels, CEO and founder of the Campaign Against Hunger in New York, Celia Cole, CEO of Feeding Texas, Monica White, President and CEO of Food Share of Ventura County in California. You are our heroes. Your people are our heroes. You are solving practical problems instead of wasting time in fruitless debates and point scoring. Please thank your boards. Thank your suppliers. Thank your funders. Thank your staffs. And thank you for sharing your wisdom with us today.